you're all able to see the slide?
Yes.
Despite him standing here in front of them. It's good for you. Okay, so since this is a meetup, I will spend a bit more time explaining things, because there's a lot of slides, not a lot of code until the very end, then we'll see some actual code. But to understand what the code is trying to do, first we need to walk through a few concepts, just to make sure we're on the same page. So the main thing here is I'm going to introduce a new type of Angular tests called feature tests. And I happen to develop a testing library called Spectacular, which has an entire API dedicated to this type of test, but it also supports a few other testing APIs. But we'll get to that later. First, let's dive into Angular itself. It's built for testability, so it has a few features out of the box for unit testing and component testing. And here's the overview of Angular's own capabilities for testing. Of course, we have dependency injection. One of the few things that's very useful for is if you do a lot of isolated unit tests. And to do that, we usually use the Angular test bed, or we basically have to, because the dependency injection and the compilation, all of that is so heavily tied into Angular itself, both at runtime and when we're running our tests. It also has a few other things, like semi-recently it got the CDK component harnesses. That's also exclusively for testing. And, looks like protractor, but Michael, what's that you're saying? That's dead? Is it dead for real this time? Okay, well, replace it with Karma. So, next up we have a few testing modules. I took out almost all mentions of ng modules for this talk because they are poor, and now we can finally leave them behind. But at this point we still have testing modules. Those might be replaced by testing function providers at some point, hopefully. I mean, even Protractor has a testing function provider, but these don't yet. So there's the router testing module, the last one. That's actually the most interesting one in my opinion, but it's under-documented and underused. And it took me a few years to figure out how to make it work and what we could use it for. And on top of that knowledge, I built this spectacular testing library. We'll get back to the router testing module, but basically it allows us to replace the routes for purpose of testing and keeping the routes from actually interacting with the browser and its native APIs. The map icon testing module, you might have seen this before if you've used Angular material. If you have custom icons loaded into the icon registry, you will need this one if you're doing tests, or you'll get some errors. The HTTP client testing module, you might have used that one. It's extremely complicated, and there's other ways to do what it does, but it allows us to intercept HTTP requests when our Angular application is using the HTTP client service. So back to the router testing module provided by Angular itself. I don't know if you've heard about it, but this is what it can be used for. We have these special concepts. In Angular we like our special concepts, and some of them are the routed components, the routing components, and the route guards. And if you want the details on what are these things, I wrote 3 articles on dev community on the This is Angular publication. Next up, we will discuss these 2 different approaches of testing, clear box testing and mystery box testing. The first one is the clear box testing, and that is when we have intricate knowledge of what's inside the box, like what is our application made up of. So in those tests, it's okay, and not only okay, like usually they center around all these very Angular specific software artifacts like the components, directives and pipes and services, and I don't mention NG modules, but those would also be there, route cars and all of these things. So what's special about this approach of testing is that we have the awareness of all the implementation details and we use that to our advantage. But it also comes at the cost of maintenance and limited refactoring capabilities, except if we're being very smart about it. So it also helps drive the code design. That's a good use of isolated unit tests and component tests. And they can also document and exercise this low-level behavior in our applications. So that's why it's often used for exactly the isolated unit tests. But it's a testing principle in itself and not necessarily tied directly to unit tests. The other approach is mystery box testing. So what's inside the box? No one knows. We can only see what's on the edge of the box. So what we see when using the mystery box testing approach is we interact as the user and we might be able to see whatever I/O or messaging or persistence outcomes that are as part of interacting with user flows and user interactions. And the way we trigger those is through things like this, figures and charts and forms and user controls and dialogues and tables and menus and all of that a user would be able to see and use. So there's no mention of components or services or anything like that. So we're unaware of how the system is made up of all of these smaller parts like functions and classes, very specific one type to Angular. But we are aware of I/O like web Bluetooth and web USB, NFC and camera and microphone and proximity sensors and ambient light sensors. And messaging like WebRTC, WebSocket Push API Server Center, for instance, persistence like web storage, the index DB, the web SQL, the HTTP and WebSockets, and GraphQL, and Firebase, and Meteor. So those are very different approaches of testing. And this approach is usually used with end-to-end tests. So that's where we use the application as a user. So it's a very different perspective from the clear box testing, where we are aware of the different parts and can call them directly without simulating user interaction. So next we're going to discuss the trade-offs of what's called Angular component tests and then end-to-end tests as we know them in relation to Angular applications. So component tests, these are the tests that use the test bed, and we create a component, maybe it has a few child components, maybe some services, or maybe we start them out with test doubles. Ideally, they interact, these component tests, they interact with the component using a DOM, not using the methods and so on the component itself, but that's a whole other technique where we can also make some trade-offs. So it used to be the case that they're slow, but especially since the introduction of IE version 9, now they are pretty fast and getting faster and faster over time. Like with different versions of Angular, different things are being improved, and compilation, caching for tests and so on is being introduced. So now they're a better choice, but they still have trade-offs. They focus on implementation details, so they are clear box tested. And when we do this, we mention in our tests things that the user doesn't really care about, like components and services and routes and pipes and all that. It's not really something the user should know about or care about at all. So that's the first trade-off. And when we use component tests using the test bed, our implementation details of the application they start to leak. So we have to be aware of how do we new up the component. Do we do it using the constructor of the component itself, or do we use the Angular test bed? And how do we even do that? How do we replace dependencies with test doubles? When and how do we trigger the change detection in the right order? Because when we're using test bed in itself, we have to act as the Angular runtime and trigger change detection, not automatically, but at certain points in time when state is changed. And more of this implementation details leaking in component tests. We have to figure out how to control time all of a sudden, and it can become difficult to see how we can refactor our application without breaking all of these component and unit tests. And on top of that, we have to figure out and learn how to configure this Angular testing module. How do we register test dollar providers? How do we register fake routes for tests? How do we register fake declarable dependencies with components depending on other declarables and pipes directly in the component? And how do we set up the compilation and injector scopes? This is a lot of things going on. I believe if you were to learn all the different techniques for testing all aspects of Angular applications, you would have to learn and use about 75 different techniques. So that's just a lot of work, and then you need to get it right. So they are fast, these component tests, this time, but complicated to write. Do we write shallow or integrated component tests? How do we link up the components' declarable dependencies between each other? How do we trigger these DOM and component events and make sure the change detection is also triggered as part of the test? Should we trigger events or call the component methods directly? How do we create a component tree in the test? Do we use the debug elements or do we use the native DOM elements? How do we create a testing host component? How do we set up the route for the test? How do we navigate across routes and components? And these two final questions, they are best solved using the router testing module. So this was my big epiphany, like for the past 2-3 years I've been looking into this and studying the code and implementation and test and lack of documentation, and I'm happy to help you support tests that take good advantage of the router testing module so that we can do these things like set up routes in our test and navigate across routes and components. Moving on to end-to-end tests. They are hard to write, at least that's how it used to be. Now they're easy to write because of the past 5 years worth of innovation in this field. So that's no excuse anymore for not writing end-to-end tests. But of course there's trade-offs. Like the good things is it's easy to use. We interact and observe as a user, so that's the mystery box testing approach. We can reuse the test setup, and it's relatively simple compared to the test bed. We have little to no use for test doubles when we're using end-to-end tests. So those are all benefits of end-to-end tests. So they're easy to write, it's easy to use, but the feedback loop is, let's say, less than ideal. Another trademark of end-to-end tests is that they are slow, at least compared to component tests. They are slow to install on CI runners, they're slow to start up, slow to execute. They might not be able to control the time in your application. They might have to wait for animations, like several seconds waiting for an animation just to run through your test. They might not even support parallel execution, so they can be a major blocker for speed. They are known to be flaky. Random times you get race conditions, or if you're integrating with real systems, or they cause premature change detection, and test will break, and you will run them again, and they will pass, and you will say, okay, let's deploy. But next time, you might not be so lucky. So they're certainly powerful, and we see that because we can exercise complete user flow, so that's acting as a user across many routes, many components, and all of that, like going through a whole area of your application as part of one test, without having to set up a lot of complicated configuration and test setup. And because of this, because we're interacting as a user and we stay unaware of all these implementation details, it allows for much bigger refactorings without breaking our tests. So that's a huge benefit. So they're powerful, but also rigid. They might not be able to replace the native APIs depending on your end-to-end testing framework with things like HTTP, website, server-side events, and camera, location, and sensory access. They might not support all the native browser features, say iframes, shadow DOM, file upload, file downloads, native events, cross-domain navigation, and multiple windows and tabs. They might not also support your existing testing toolchain, like different testing runners, different schedulers to control time, or your favorite assertion library, or your favorite test double library, or my very favorite tool, WallabyJS. And finally, they cannot replace individual parts of your application with test doubles. You have to spin up the entire application. It's all or nothing. So if I wanted to replace a complicated backend with just a fake instance of the service, I would struggle to do that with most end-to-end tests. Whereas with the component test, I replace one service for the other, and I'm done with my business. So let's pretend that the dear Goldilocks is our testing coach. You know, she doesn't want it too warm, and she doesn't want it too cold. She wants the best of both worlds in between. Now that we've described all these characteristics of mystery box testing and clear box testing, and pros and cons of end-to-end tests and component tests, let's talk to Goldilocks and see how we can get the best of both worlds. So Goldilocks' choice for Angular test is we want reproducible tests so we can repeat again and again and get the same result. We want a simple and reusable test setup that we can share. We want tests to run pretty fast because they don't have to wait for an entire application and a testing framework to spin up from scratch or have to wait for animations. So we want to use mystery box feature testing so that we have little to no need for test doubles, and we don't have to reference all the implementation detail of all these boring classes and functions and so on. We want to interact with and observe our application as a user, and we want the capability to exercise a complete user flow across many routes, many components, and many parts of our application. How can we get this Goldilocks choice of Angular tests? Say hello.
Hello.
Hello. Say hello, spectacular.
Hello, spectacular.
Say hello, spectacular and Angular testing library.
Spectacular and Angular testing library.
Hello, Tim Schreier. He's the creator of Angular testing library. I'm the creator of Spectacular, created by NG workers and me. And Spectacular is an integration testing library for Angular. It has these 3 different APIs. Application testing for things like application initializers and bootstrap listeners, the feature testing API that we're going to explore, and the pipe testing API for integrated Angular pipe testing. So Spectacular offers specialized test harnesses to make it more convenient to test these things, parts of Angular that are very specific to Angular in a realistic situation. So rather than calling a class through its method, if you like to spin up a testing application or a testing component to test a pipe and host it, or trigger the life cycles of an application if you want to test bootstrap listeners. But today it's this feature testing API we're talking about. Because here it allows us to test the routed Angular feature. I wrote modules. It allows us to test the routed Angular features, and it provides feature-aware navigation services. So don't worry, we'll figure out what that is later on. And it offers a reusable test route component. So this is all the things you need to bootstrap a whole feature or a whole domain of your application as part of one test, without having to set up 100 lines of test setup and so on. More than this, Spectacular doesn't attempt to solve every problem in the world, so rather than having an API for interacting with DOM and as a user and so on, instead it integrates well with Angular testing library or component harnesses based on Angular CDK. So what is an Angular test? Well, that's Goldilocks' choice on Angular tests. They test about an Angular feature as a mystery box, like end-to-end tests. It interacts and verifies as a user, like an end-to-end test. And most importantly, it allows us to exercise a complete user flow across many routes and components, an entire domain of the application within one test. So every route of one entire feature or domain will be available in your test, going through all the test steps. Not just one route, not just one component, but everything, at least the scope you want. You can have an entire domain, all the routes in a lazy loaded domain or lazy loaded feature. So every box here doesn't represent these implementation specific details like components and so on. Instead, it's the mystery box testing approach where we look at there's a feature or domain, there's a screen, and we click an element in that to go to another screen, and then we enter some information, and we end up on the third screen, or we choose the dialog menu. So there's nothing in here like components, directives, and types, and that's intentional. They're not mentioned in the test at all. So Angular feature tests, they're fast, they're independent, they have no need for an actual code application, and this is interesting in the case of something like micro front-ends or teams that want to work in isolation. They don't have to wait for an actual application. We can test an entire feature of the domain in isolation without having any Angular application project. So that's particularly interesting from my perspective. And we're dogfooding this for Spectacular itself. It has integration tests or feature tests running against the 2 or fewer router tutorial because it uses some very advanced features of the Angular router, and we want to make sure we can cover all of that using Spectacular on its own, but also integrated with Angular testing library. So if you want to see examples of this, go to the documentation for Spectacular, look at its test in the GitHub repo, or some of my public, private, or personal GitHub repositories also have feature tests with Spectacular. So, also, while we try to avoid using test doubles, similar to an end-to-end test, we can, if we need, or if it's the most convenient, we can replace individual parts or individual services through our feature tests. And they're orders of magnitude faster than end-to-end tests. That's a huge benefit. It's the speed of the test bed with the benefits of an end-to-end test. They don't have to wait for animations to run. We can disable them. They can replace slow dependencies. They don't have to spin up an entire application. They can spin up just this little world of domain within your application, not the whole thing. And they benefit from these optimizations from the Angular team, like this cache compilation output for tests, and the reuse of the Angular testing platform. So this is the first code we see now. Here we have the edit crisis feature test. First we see only the test setup, and believe me, this is easy for component test or for test bed, but maybe you don't know Angular testing library. That's what we're seeing here. The render function comes from Angular testing library. We also have a supporting library here called user web for testing library, and that is set up here. This is the version 14 API where you have to call this function and you get the user API. We'll see that in use in just a few slides. So this is Angular testing library. We call it render function, and then we pass it the component we want to test usually, but in the case of the feature test, we want to pretend we have an application. So Spectacular has an app component that we can reuse for tests. It doesn't really have anything in it except for router outlet to kind of bootstrap your routes into this outlet of the component. And now, while I also have a testing module as part of Spectacular, now we also have a standalone function, provide Spectacular feature test. This is what Angular standalone APIs will also look like, something already there, like provide browser animations or provide no-op animations. So similar thing here, we add a provider and we provide Spectacular feature test. We give it a feature path. That's the route path prefix of our Angular feature. So in this case, it's a variable containing string crisis center, and it's stored in a variable in the actual feature library here, 2 of heroes crisis center. So it's this variable with a string called crisis center path, and we also expose the crisis center routes, and they are added here. This is another option in the Angular testing library. So these are the components or the APIs we need to set up a feature test with Angular testing library and Spectacular. A lot of things goes on behind the scene, but you don't have to worry about that. Mostly what you have to worry about is this is the feature defined by these routes that I want to test. That's the scope of my test. I'm able to navigate between all of these routes and all the components represented by these routes. So that's what we want to do today. This is the scope of my test. I'm able to access everything in this feature defined by the route. More than that, there's a few convenience services. There's the Spectacular feature location, which is a feature-aware service, wrapping Angular's own location service, and the same thing for Angular's own router is also wrapped in this feature-aware service by Spectacular. We'll see it in use in a few slides, and then hopefully you'll understand the convenience. So that's the test setup. That's a small test setup for a testbed test, especially since it can contain 100 components and services with just these 30 lines of test setup code. So next up is the actual feature tests. Now that we set everything up, or rather that's done here at the command line, first we navigate to one of the routes in our feature, and this is where we have this feature-aware router. We use this special tilde character, the current thing, to say within this feature, go to a relative path with the route of crisis ID, which in this case is the crisis with the ID of 2. So we navigate to, if we're in our Angular app, we would say the app's domain / crisis center / 2. That's what we're doing here, but without repeating this crisis center string. And because we do this, we're also able to support the, in my opinion, anti-pattern of magic strings containing this crisis center path spread all over our templates, especially when using the router link directive. But that's a very common practice, and to be able to support that, we have to use the same route path prefix. But with Spectacular, we mention it just once in the setup, and then in the other locations, we can say the tilde character instead of the actual feature prefix. The next block of code we see here, those are the acting test steps. Here we're using this user event library from the testing library family. We say use clear, and we point it to some element that has a placeholder text of name. So that's the crisis name form control. And then we type into that same text box and edit the name of the crisis to the global temperature is rising. And finally we click, using the user event API, the button So this is using area attributes and roles, semantic roles from HTML and area attributes. Avoid mentioning these implementation details like this .selected class, but this is the Angular 2 of Heroes Rubber tutorial. And I didn't want to change the implementation. I want to be able to support all these questionable use practices. They should have, ideally we would be able to select by role, like we did with the button, but there's nothing significant about the select thing. Also, it's mostly a visual aid, so it's not that important, but it's important for our test case in that now we're navigating back to another place in the feature, and this new name is selected in a list of links. And finally, here's where the Angular 2 of Heroes Router tutorial uses some of these advanced concepts. In this case, it's what's called matrix parameters. So they add the ID as a matrix parameter, and they add foo because that's what you do, right? But here we see again the tilde character used. So this is because we're using the spectacular feature location service to inspect the path relative to the feature. So internally, it will translate so that it doesn't say crisis center here. We don't have to mention that. We can just say the tilde character / and then we're at the default route, but we have these matrix parameters added. So this is gibberish, but it's what's in the router tutorial, and I wanted to make sure we can support all those advanced use cases. Okay. Another thing to notice here is that there's no manual or auto change detection being used in this test. And that's thanks to Angular testing library and the user event testing library. Because normally in some of these steps we would have to call component fixture detect changes or something like that in between the steps. But when we're using these, especially this one is good, there's a whole bunch of different query by, and this is my favorite one, find by, because it returns a promise. So similar to Cypress end-to-end tests, we can wait for that element to be listed in the DOM, even if there's some change detection and things going on in the background. You can wait for that navigation to complete and all the async stuff and change detection to complete, so that we are able to support or to find that button, to click it. And of course, similar to Cypress, there's a timeout as well. There's a default one. I cannot remember if it's 1 or 2 seconds. Of course, there's an option to increase that if we need to. But yeah, normally in a component test, you would see component fixture, detect changes between some of these steps here. I mean, there's a lot of await async, but we don't have to take the role of the framework and call change detection between the different steps. Yeah, so this is an example of a complete user flow as a user, spanning many, multiple routes, multiple components. And there's just another one here which is very similar, but it starts at the Crisis Center homepage. So we're navigating to the default route, / that's the default route of this feature. And then we click one of the crises using its link text to end up on the edit crisis screen that we used before. But in the previous test, we started at that location. We gave it an ID as part of the URL. Here we're starting at the home page, clicking an element, moving on to the edit page right here, and clicking save, going back to the Crisis Center home, and making sure we're at the Crisis Center because it will say, welcome to the Crisis Center, that's the home page. And then finally, again, that we have this element is selected and the text has changed. So this is what the user will see to confirm that what they wanted to happen did happen, and they ended up in the place they expected. So similar, but we're going through even one more route in the beginning. But we have the same test set up, like where the comment is. There will be all this spectacular and Angular testing library render and so on. So let's improve this by extracting out this shared test setup and the shared variables. That's what we're doing here. We are, instead of copy-pasting the test setup to these two test cases, the it blocks, now we introduced it before each hook to our tests, and we paste the things in here instead with the user event setup, the render function being called, resolving these feature-aware navigation services and storing them in these shared variables that are available to all the test cases. So when we go back to the test case now, before that we have one more improvement, and that is instead of querying for these elements as part of the test cases, we make what's called named queries, so that we don't have to see all these information details of the testing API. Instead, we can call them find the save button, and still using a promise, right? So when we do this, these name selectors, and we go back to our test case. Now this is the full block of the test case. The setup is up in the describe block with the before each hook, and the name queries are in the global scope of the test before or inside the describe block. And the test case itself here is hopefully becoming a little clearer. So we start by navigating to the route of the crisis with ID of 2. It almost reads like a user now. It's starting to look like it. The user clears the name control. The user types in the name control. And this is the new name we give the crisis. Global temperature is rising. Now we click the save button. And then finally to verify that what happened, that we wanted to happen, actually happened, using the DOM. Find the selected crisis with this text that we just put in on a different route. And finally, these strange matrix parameters that they are also in the URL, the address bar of our browser. And the other test is the same kind of improvements, except in the beginning we're going to the feature relative route, the default one, and then we're clicking a link to end up on the edit screen. And then finally, instead of inspecting the URL, instead we're seeing, okay, we're at the Crisis Center home screen because we're seeing the greeting message, and it's in the document. This is a matcher for Jest, added by a library called Jest DOM, that's also part of the testing library. Phew. So all these testing libraries, all these things, and now we're starting to have a nice looking test that go through many routes and many components, interact as a user, and importantly, there's no mention here of components and services, all of that, so you can change that all you want as long as the user behavior stays the same. So from that perspective, it's similar to an end-to-end test, and that's because we're using the mystery box approach of testing here. All right, almost done. But there's this new technique called ciphers. I don't remember what it's shorthand for something. It came out of the Firebase team at Firebase. Came from the Firebase team at Google. And in this pattern, we extract a function, and usually we call it setup or setup feature, whatever makes sense. And here we have these things of the common test setup of calling Angular testing library and spectacular and the user event library, but it's wrapped in a function that we can call at our convenience, which also helps us control the timing of our tests, which can be important when we have something dynamic going on in our tests. And then to have, instead of having shared variables that are shared in a shared scope, instead we return the shared APIs. So return an object that has a location property, a router property, and a user property. And this is what we saw before. It's the spectacular feature location service, spectacular feature router service, and this user event API that has been set up. So using this in the test cases, it looks like this. Here we don't do anything before calling setup function, but in some cases it might have parameters that we can pass to set up things that are different between our test. We don't have any differences at this point in time in our little test suite. But to access the shared APIs, now we use object destructuring to access the location, the router, and the user APIs. Other than that, it's exactly the same as before. Like we still have access to the location, we still have access to the user, we still have access to the router variable. And the same for the second one, except in this case we see that it only requires the router and the user, so it doesn't require the location service. So we omit that from our object destructuring setup method. That is everything from the code samples. Let's conclude on what we learned. There was a lot of concepts. With all these concepts in our toolbox now, we can create a testing strategy for Angular inspired by Kent does. He calls this the testing trophy instead of the, what's it called, normally like the testing pyramid, right? So his perspective is we should have a lot more of these, what he defines as integration tests. And that's exactly what I've been trying to describe today. With React testing library that he created and the DOM testing library, it's more straightforward to create these integration tests that can span an entire feature or an entire domain of our application. But with Angular, with all these Angular-specific lifecycle hooks and routers and classes and all that, it's a little bit more difficult. So it's not as straightforward, so it's taken me several years to figure this stuff out. But now that we have it, we can say that feature tests can replace most end-to-end tests, but they should not replace all of them. So my rule of thumb is, I mean, if you like end-to-end tests, use them, for God's sake. But if you learn feature tests, you can get some of the other benefits, right? So in my testing strategy, I will use end-to-end tests for cross-domain user flows, such as logging in or registering or switching the language or something like that. Feature tests can also complement unit test and component test, but they should not replace all of that. Like there's still value in isolated unit tests for complex services, or maybe something like a presentational shared component, like the button component from your corporate design system. That would still benefit from something like a component test, like the Cypress component test Reiner is going to talk about. Feature tests, they do not aid in system design or code documentation of the APIs, but they do support refactoring without breaking all of our tests. So we can refactor everything inside of a feature, we can change it as soon or as long as the user behavior is the same. We still have test coverage of all this using feature tests. Feature tests, you might remember, they're the Goldilocks choice. They're resilient to refactoring, as we discussed. They are granular enough, like they don't cover the entire app, but we carve out at least a corner of the application, a domain or a feature, whatever we want to call it, and say this is our scope, that we want our tests to be able to move between the routes and the user flow supported by this feature, this domain. And they're up to orders of magnitude faster than end-to-end tests because of using Jest and using the test bed and all these optimizations. So overall, the testing, the total text execution and startup time and reusability should give you a much faster result. They give us very high confidence in the desired behavior because we describe in our test everything a user should see and expect from the application. They're sufficiently isolated, so we can use all the components and services as is, but if we need it, we can replace them with, for example, to skip a slow API, we can replace that with another class for the test. That's what we determine as the best solution. We interact and verify the application feature as a user, We have a shared, relatively simple test setup that we can share between the test cases. We stay unaware of all the implementation details about the actual components in the feature services and all that. And yeah, same thing I said before, that we can skip browser APIs or backends or anything like that if we need to, when we need to. That's all from me. Spectacular is the first testing library, support feature test. Just a few more words, Michael. It's worth mentioning they can be written without Spectacular, so there's value in feature tests. If you find out another way to do them, maybe with Cypress component test, or maybe with ng marks or anything like that, please do it. But Spectacular will give you a few convenience APIs. It will help you set up the routes and may be able to use this tilde character. Now with standalone Angular features, it's easier to do feature tests with Angular testing library without Spectacular, but there's still a few benefits that you can reuse from Spectacular. You don't have to implement that yourself. So now with Angular modules going bye-bye, things become easier in the testing world as well. So that's great to see. But even a standalone application like Spectacular still has a place in the world. So look at the documentation, the examples, test in the actual repo, and you'll see how all of this ties together in even more detail. Yeah, that was it.
Amazing. I have a ton of questions, a load of questions. But before I start with my questions, maybe some other questions are here in the room. Every question has the opportunity, possibility to win one of these incredible cool prizes that we will raffle after the meetup. So hands up for the first question in the room here.
Exception handling.
Exception handling. What?
What happens if we don't find element?
Well, if you're using Angular testing library, you'll get a debug message where you can see the DOM that the test sees. If you want some visual feedback, use CarMap so that you can see it in a real browser. So that's basically it. Like you'll get some helpful error output to see what is the user seeing, so to speak, like that. And go from there.
How much faster is it? You said a multitude faster than end-to-end tests. I'm missing numbers.
We can set something up for sure.
What roughly?
Well, yeah, like this, like an entire domain, setting that up and navigating between 3 or 4 routes. That's half a second for one test. The more tests you have, the more reusability, so the more speed benefit compared to seconds or tens of seconds with end-to-end tests. If you have just very few routes, very few components, then it's like 10 to 50 milliseconds per test. We're still covering many components and a few routes and components. So the navigation is usually the heavy part, because a lot is happening within Angular. So.
Yeah, spinning up the whole app is also a big part, right? The bigger the app in an end-to-end test, you have like everything else.
I mean, you're expert at performance optimizations, and then hopefully you don't load anything eagerly that you don't need. So in that case, the benefit is not as clear. But yeah, surely if you have a poorly optimized or just the client wasn't paying for that time to optimize it, like yeah, Spectacular can benefit you, or feature test can benefit you, because you don't have to wait for that slow application to load up the entire thing when you just wanted to go through a few buttons and menus in the corner of the application.
I would say the bigger the app is, the slower it is, and they normally don't care about loading just the stuff that they need. So I can see at least that one of the bigger apps that I work with is like 10 to 20 seconds bootstrapping, which is really a lot. So there's a test over there. There's a test over there. What's your test?
Is there a repo where there are sample implementation with spectacular?
Yes, and we have a mono repo for NG workers. There you can find tests where Spectacular is using just a test bed to test this crisis center feature from the two viewers. So that is, we're using an NX workspace, so we have a feature library for the crisis center. We're testing that. Like Spectacular has a different API if you're only using the test bed